Well, here we are. Here we are. Hello, once again, and welcome to the Prince Magnum channel, where hot rodding and romance do coexist. I'm your host, Prince Magnum. Welcome to Do It Yourself Budget Hot Rodding, live and uncut. All right. Before we get underway, let me say right now up front, first things first. I hate to. This is the first time I've ever done this live. First things first. I'm gonna basically be doing kind of like two versions, but I thought it would be kind of cool to go live and uncut. But unfortunately, I had to turn off the chat because I was having a hard time with that with yesterday's live stream. But I thought it would be just kind of cool to kind of talk about, to kind of go into performance not included, and basically, you know, no editing, no nothing, just me explaining performance of the 1970s and 80s, because there was improvements. There was improvements in performance. We always think the muscle car era from 1964 to 1970 that was as good as it got, and that's just really crass. And you always hear people say, "Oh, there wasn't any performance in the '70s," when all of us hot rodders know a whole lot better than that. We know better. Okay. Now, again, there was performance. There was. You just had to be a do-it-yourselfer. You had to put it in place. So without further ado, let's not jerk around. Let's not beat around the bush. Let's get on with this. First things first. We're talking about performance of the 1970s and ignition systems. We're going to have to do a little bit of a history lesson. Now, for those of us who have been in car culture most of our lives, I started out in the car culture at the age of 16. I'm 38 now, be 39 this August. When you start looking at the car culture, you know, start looking at cars as far back as like the Model T. The Model T, it's 4-cylinder engine with the, you know, the crank. There wasn't a starter. Just used the simple magneto and a couple copper wires to some spark plugs, and that was pretty much it. That was the ignition system back then. But what was ingenious about it was, at the time, weather would actually mess with that ignition, and inside the car, you know, you could actually adjust the spark advance from inside the vehicle. So when wet weather, cold weather would start, you know, kind of messing with the ignition system, you could adjust that spark advance and not even have to stop the vehicle. So that's actually pretty cool. All right, and my cigar went out. We'll fast forward. I know at some point, you know, in the 1950s, you know, you had in the very first Corvette in 1953, there was a particular engine that was that came out in the Corvettes. It was the 230, 235, something like that, and had three one-barrel carburetors. And I've heard some of the people on other YouTube creators kind of put down that inline six, saying it was anemic and things like that. And we'll get to talking a little bit more about that a little further on, but for right now, bear with me. That particular inline six was called the Blue Flame. Now, up to this point, basically, if you could see the combustion, basically see the combustion inside of an engine at that time, the flame from inside the combustion chamber would be orange. Now, anybody who knows combustion knows that that's not complete combustion. For example, if you were to be, let's say you had you were frying a turkey outside, and you've got your propane burner going. You know that orange flames look cool, but that's not complete combustion. You want it blue. See where this is going? The blue flame had a more complete combustion. So it means it was burning more of its fuel, and that fuel, by burning more of that fuel, it provided more power. And this was in 1953. But it wasn't perfect. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. It still relied on a mechanical distributor. What is a mechanical distributor? It uses points. So when you get into the 1960s, the muscle car era is in full swing, and believe it or not, the ignition systems are not that they're not that great. The points. I mean, there was a lot of problems with the points. Ask anybody who's ever tried to fiddle fart with them and try to get the the gap in them just right. I know with Chevrolet, I don't know the rest of GM, but with Chevrolet, it really didn't matter if the points were in or the points were out. You could adjust them, you could adjust them either way, and they'd be fine. But I know with Ford, they had to be in. They had to be in, or you would burn them up. And I don't know about Mopar. For those who are kind of not familiar, when I say Mopar, that's Chrysler, Plymouth, Dodge. That's Mopar. And I don't know enough about AMC. AMC is that that unusual brand that you got to be a real connoisseur of classic cars to understand AMC. But I digress. All right. So your mechanical distributors, points ignition is not perfect. With a little bit of time, you're not getting the best spark down to your the best amount of juice down to your spark plugs. So performance was inconsistent. On top of that, like I said, it was really easy to burn up points. It really was. It was unbelievably easy to burn up points. Now, I know some of your old hot rodders still swear by them, but honestly and truthfully, it's more of a hassle than it's worth. To give you an idea, if you've ever worked a drive-through and a guy coming through with a classic car from the 1960s, it always has this horrible gas smell to the exhaust. I mean, you open up the window to give them their order or to whatever, take their money, what have you, and you're choking on the gasoline smell. Well, that's because of the points, and have a set burn up on you. I know my dad used to race a 66 Mustang GT Coupe, had the 289 in it, 4-speed manual, and he'd have a set of points burn up in him right in the middle of a race. And I mean, that's just, so this was a problem in the 1960s, and this was with the muscle car era. Now, granted that these, this system did rocket the, did rocket the muscle cars up to those astronomical numbers of horsepower, but again, it wasn't perfect. By the way, side note, if you've ever wondered why your car, even today, cars still have the accessories set up on it, well, that's because of points. If you turned it to the on position, but you didn't turn it to started, you would burn up your points. So car manufacturers added in the accessory position so you didn't burn up your points, and that's why. And for the most part, I mean, honestly and truthfully, the cars really don't need it today, but the manufacturers continue to put them in there. So I mean, this is why points were not that great. Also, to go along with this, leaded fuel was still a thing in the 1960s. So again, with points, not only is it not burning all the fuel like it's supposed to, but you're also throwing a lot of lead into the atmosphere, and people basically were getting, they were breathing in this lead, and so it was bad all the way around. Cars in the 1960s were just massive, massive problems. So when 1970 rolled in, the muscle car era was the last hurrah for the muscle car era, was 1970. I don't care what some jabroni said somewhere else. I don't care what car manufacturers are trying to say today. Oh, we create muscle car. No, you don't. Okay. The muscle car era, the official year in the history books, known by every hot rodder and every performance, old performance enthusiast. We all know the muscle car era, 1970. Period. I don't care what and I know there's going to be some modern car enthusiasts that are going to, no, 1970. If you have a new Mustang, a new Camaro, or a new Dodge Challenger, you do not have a muscle car. You have an American tuner with muscle car DNA, which is not the same thing, okay? But I digress. Now, again, muscle car era is over. Car companies have to start looking at emissions laws. The insurance companies are, have really, it was over. The writing was on the wall. So at this point, car manufacturers, Ford, General Motors, Chevrolet, Buick, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, and so on and so on. And of course, Mopar, and of course, AMC, they needed an upgrade. They needed an upgrade so they couldn't necessarily put performance into their vehicles per se because of the problems with fuel economy and things like that. And then, of course, later on, smog equipment, what you all might call EGR equipment. Today, the smog equipment was coming on, like catalytic converters and smog pumps, things like that. All that was going to be coming online. By the way, side note on smog equipment, the first car to ever get it, to my knowledge, was the 1970 Chevrolet Corvette. Surprise, surprise. That being said, this stuff came online. Automakers realized that people still wanted performance. They were gonna want performance, so they needed an upgrade. Where did that upgrade come? It came from, believe it or not, electronic ignition. And that came online in 1974. Now, to my knowledge, with electronic ignition, I know Ford was putting it in their cars in 1974, and I know General Motors was doing it in 1974. Started with electronic ignition. That meant that points were gone. Mechanical distributors were out. This means that you no longer had to fiddle fart with points. Okay, no more feeler gauges. No more after a few months your car was pumping, exhaust fumes that smelled like gas and killing everything in sight. And the people through drive-through didn't want to open up and give you your order because they were going to choke. No, that was gone. That meant that with the right adjustments, you could potentially get more bang for your buck out of every drop of fuel that was going into your combustion chamber. That means when you're doing that, your car uses less fuel. I mean, less is more in this case. And if you will, and I know some of you might try to argue with this, you could tinker around with that whole setup and get more performance. Again, performance not included. You had to put it in, okay? Now, I actually have here, and I showed this briefly in yesterday's live stream. This is an electronic distributor from for the inline six Ford. This would actually fit in Project Spirit. Again, you're going to notice right away there is no points. There is no points up here. This uses a pickup coil, and again, I mean, the one that was in Project Spirit, I can guarantee. I mean, again, that's one of the things that burned up when she was down for those 6 months. So these things last a long, long time. The pickup coil that was in Project Spirit, believe it or not, lasted 42 years. That's a long time, folks. That's a very long time, okay? It basically fits right down into the engine, hooks up exactly the same way as the old ones. You even timed them the same way as the old ones. It was the same setup, okay? That's freaking cool, okay? It's the same setup, but more consistent with performance. and fuel economy and reliability. This was the upgraded that car manufacturers needed. Now, some of you again will argue that okay, well, this is an upgrade, but there wasn't much. Again, as the title says for the video, performance not included. You had to do it yourself. You had to put in the performance yourself. You had to, again, you had to put in the time and effort. There's a gentleman, and I forget what video, and I might have to go looking. He was talking about his 74 Maverick Grabber. And the Maverick Grabber in 1974 didn't have much in the way of performance, but you were one do-it-yourself project, away from outrunning pretty much. You could keep up with cars of the, of the 60s now, and still get better fuel economy. That's the sweet thing about electronic ignition. How good was it? Well, we didn't start seeing it phased out until the 90s. I know Chevrolet was still throwing it on 350s all the way up until like, I'm going to go out on a limb. I know they were throwing it on Chevrolet 350s in the mid 90s still. I honestly think they were even throwing it on the Vortec 350s in the 90s. I know there was some 90s Camaros, you could pop the hood and still find a distributor. Same electronic ignition, same setup. I know the 302 Windsor, better known as the 5.0 to many of you young people out there, was still being thrown in Mustangs, I believe, all the way up until 1997. If that's an indicator how good it was. Now, again, after that, we started, it was replaced, digital ignition came online, and some of you might even try to say, well, that's better than the electronic ignition. That's debatable, okay? You could still take an old school Chevrolet 350 with the electronic ignition, and I know there's some guys that are getting all the way up to 700 horses today out of a little small block, and numbers like that did not exist unless it was a big block, and we're talking, it was, it only seen the drag strip. So Chevrolet 350s can get those numbers with the electronic ignition upgraded, like it was in the 1970s. That's freaking awesome. So it's that middle of the road gap, if you will, between the digital world that we know today and getting away from the mechanical distributors of the 1960s. Basically, fuel economy is achievable with that setup. That's why Project Spirit does so well, even today, with all the stuff that they do to modern cars. And she's of a much simpler design. Again, if you're just getting into the hot rod community, again, the 1970s and 80s, from the factory, the numbers were wretched, but you could easily obtain serious performance if you wanted. You just had to put the work in yourself. That's why this series is called Performance Not Included. You had to do it yourself, and that's awesome. Again, that's one of the reasons why I like the cars of the 1970s and 80s, because the technology was there. Also, because of being able to, because those distributors are pretty much, the same as the old mechanical distributors. They were set up the same. You can retrofit your engines from the 1960s, and a lot of times you would also see a jump in performance just by doing that little bit of an upgrade. Real quick, kind of a side note, there was attempts before electronic ignition came out to try to get rid of the mechanical distributors. I only know of one, but I've heard that there were other attempts, but I know of one, and it came about in 1968 and lasted till about the end of 1969. There was a particular option that was available for, I know, the Camaro and the Corvette. It was called the transistor ignition, and basically it worked on radio waves, but there was it worked, and it worked well, but there was a serious downfall. It had to have this special shield that went around the distributor, and the problem was if you didn't have that shield on there, someone driving by listening to the radio could accidentally start your car. So you can see the problem with that. That's why they had to have the shield on it. Again, this is, this was a downfall of it, but just one of them things, So again, if just because just because the numbers weren't there in the 1970s and 1980s doesn't mean that they couldn't be there. Okay. Real quick, while we're talking about distributors and electronic ignition, again, I mentioned BST4 channel yesterday on the live stream, and that being okay. Sorry about that. Yesterday, I mentioned BST4 channel on the live stream, and basically, now that this is done, I don't really necessarily need this distributor. And my boy on BST4 channel, he was he thinks he might have the mechanical distributor and working with points. I don't want to have to let him deal with that sort of stuff. So basically, in a nutshell, okay, sorry about that. And I'm probably going to have to answer the phone because Princess Faye is just trying to. It never fails. Why does the phone ring when you are in the shower? Well, why does the phone ring whenever a YouTube creator is trying to do a video? Okay, back to the task at hand. Basically, that distributor, if my boy on BST4 channel needs, I'll be glad to box it up and ship it out to him. He knows how to get a hold of me. He's more than welcome to it because he thinks he might have a mechanical distributor, and I'd hate for him to have to deal with that sort of crap. Okay. Because I know Princess Faye is going to probably call again. I love her to pieces, but that's just one that she must be out of work. She's getting ready to head home. Again, it never fails. All right. Real quick, before I get into the usual ending montage and that sort of thing, if you like, real quick, again, if you've never checked out my boy on BST4 channel, please do so. You are definitely missing out if you don't check out his channel. On top of that, I want to give a big shout out to my boy, the Cadillac Kid up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I always appreciate the work that he does. He's really, really bummed out about losing his monetization, but I got a funny feeling with his whole, his tenacity, he'll be back on top, no problem. That's just my boy, he's good at what he does. Also, I've started my Patreon account. The Patreon account is up and running. Just log into Patreon. It's under Prince Magnum. You are everyone is more than welcome to donate. Again, if you've got it, great. If you don't, hey, I understand. There's also right now, I have put up my very first poll. If you're interested in leaving, put something on that poll. Basically, should I consider, after that 45-year marker with Project Spirit, should I consider doing the custom V8, or should I go ahead and rebuild her inline six and throw some old school hot rodding right into it to make her interesting? There's not too many cars out there that still have their original engine as its hot rod engine. A lot of people, when they get the inline sixes, first thing to do is they throw it out, and that's kind of a shame because inline sixes used to be, before V8s were the thing, at one time that was the best you got in this country. And in this country, it's either 4-cylinder or V8, and there's no in between, which is stupid. Okay. All right. Real quick, also again, big shout out to Bert on Bert TV, because I know if I don't give him a shout out, he's gonna, hey man, you didn't mention it. I gotta tease them. Gotta tease them. And as usual, get out there and work on a project. Don't care what it is. Just do something with yourself. Idle hands and a creative mind don't make very good bedfellows. So do something with yourself. If you have a sweetheart, sweep her off her feet. Take her out for a ride in your project car. If you don't have a project car, just take her for a ride out in your car. It don't matter. Something to be said about cruising still. And as usual, for all of you out there, if no one out there has told you that they love you today, Prince Magnum does. God bless you and have a happy 24. Thank you.